both in the context of the ICJ ruling, but also I know that there's a case in Oakland right now being brought by the U.S. Center for Constitutional Rights that is implicating the Biden administration because they are enabling Israel's what was found to be at least enough of a genocidal intent that the court felt obligated to say, you got to stop doing it. We're enjoining you from doing this, and preserve evidence, frankly, that the Biden administration would have culpability within the context of that. Where does it stand within the context of the ICJ, and where does it stand under the context of U.S. law?
Okay, so international law is this weird. It's this weird body of law. It's there's no enforcement mechanism. There's no like police force. There's no. It's not the same as regular laws. The way that international law works is by consent of states. So a state has to agree to be bound by a treaty, convention, which is just another way of saying contract. So if a country wants to sign on to a treaty, they agree to be bound by it. But, and that's the way that it generally works. But then there are some laws that it doesn't matter if you've signed on to the convention, if you signed on to the treaty. They're kind of like supra laws that bind every state. Genocide is one of those. So it doesn't matter whether a country is signed on to the Genocide Convention. Because genocide is so heinous, it binds all countries. So whether they've signed on to this treaty or convention or not. And so the third state responsibility rests with each and every state. And in particular, now that we have this provisional measure, this interim decision that came out from the ICJ, it's placed not only Israel on notice, but it's placed every other country on notice as well. And this is where it's now going to become very important for people to be pushing to make sure that genocide doesn't happen or doesn't continue. And that's through things like pushing for arms embargo, pushing to hold Israel accountable, pushing for people who have made these genocidal statements and who've carried out some acts to be held accountable as well. And then there's other measures like through boycotts, through divestment, through sanctions. There's a whole host of measures. And it's because genocide binds all of us, and all of us should be compelled to stop it. And that's why this case is happening by the Center for Constitutional Rights, because again, it's the idea that genocide is one of these supra laws, that it doesn't matter who is signed on to it. All that matters is that it obligates all of us.
In the U.S., if I'm not mistaken, it has signed on to the Genocide Convention.
Yes.
I think it was in the early 80s, yes, under Reagan. It seems to me that there's also like different types of culpability based upon obligations, right? Like we have, on one hand, the U.S. is providing weapons that are being used in, what the ICJ found could potentially be a genocide. Certainly, the intent is there and the acts carried out. But it also, the ICJ also required Israel to take measures to improve the humanitarian situation for Palestinian civilians. Within moments of the ICJ ruling, Israel accused 12 employees of, and I had mentioned to you that I have trouble saying this, UNRWA, the UN refugee and works agency that provides half of the population in Gaza right now with some form of temporary housing, provides probably more than, that million people with whatever food or water they have access to, among other things. They accused, and there's, if I'm not mistaken, 13,000 employees, 12 of them of participate in the October 7th attack. The agency immediately fired I think there was 9 that are still alive. But the idea that these different countries would suspend their aid, it seems to me, like, just with my limited legal understanding, if you have taken upon yourself to fund an agency, and that agency is really established as now the only entity that can provide the aid that is necessary, and then you suspend it, you are making that deliverance of that aid almost impossible at this point, because you can't come in there and create another agency of 13,000 people. That's not going to happen right now. Certainly not in this. I don't know what it would take in a non sort of like assault situation, but it's just not possible. And that is obvious. And there's a concept under the at least U.S. Civil law that when you decide to take upon an action, you have certain higher responsibility than if you had never engaged in it at all. And so how is the suspension of this aid not on its face a violation of the ICJ ruling?
Good question. I think that's what you're going to have to ask the White House, because I agree with you 100%. And you don't need to be a lawyer to understand that. The UNRWA not only is providing assistance, but it's providing shelter. There are Palestinians who have been sheltering in UNRWA schools since the beginning, and at some points in time, we're providing aid and assistance to individuals. It is the largest aid agency that is in the Gaza Strip. And so cutting funding to UNRWA can only be viewed in a way of cutting assistance, much needed humanitarian assistance to people, particularly in the aftermath of hearing an ICJ ruling. So I don't know how they're going to try to spin this. And, Sam, there's things about this that are very troublesome. These accusations come out and there's no investigation. It's just immediate cutting off of aid. But more importantly than that, we've seen actual war crimes being committed. If anybody's been paying attention to what Israel's been doing, you watch it, you see it on a daily basis. And I don't hear any discussion in the US on a political level, that is, of cutting off assistance to Israel. And if they do, it's always, we first need to investigate. For example, in May of 2022, a friend of mine, a journalist, Shireen Abu Akleh, who worked for Al Jazeera, she's an American citizen, and she was reporting from Jenin. An Israeli sniper shot her in the back of the head and killed her. And to this day, nobody's ever been held to account for Shireen's killing. And yet I still don't hear anybody talking about holding Israel accountable, cutting off any aid, cutting off any, it's as though it was okay to kill her. And it's not okay to kill her. But this is the problem with this approach that successive U.S. administrations have taken when it comes to Israel, which is that Israel can do no wrong. And when Israel shows itself for what it is, it's, again, we just turn a blind eye, or even worse, try to somehow justify it. So even with this ICJ ruling, even though the court is clear, the U.S. tried to spin it as somehow that this is along the lines of what the U.S. has been calling for, but it's not. It's not along the lines of what the U.S. is calling for. The U.S. has been Israel's enabler. It's been Israel's defender. It's been Israel's bully when it comes to being in the UN Security Council.
And maybe this is outside your portfolio, but the timing of these accusations. I mean, even if one was to stipulate that these accusations may be true or are true, I would contend the idea of holding an organization that large for what 12 people did is absurd. It's unprecedented. We've not seen that certainly within the context of American society, and never mind in any other society. That seems to be unprecedented, even if we stipulate the accusations are true. The timing of it, the speed, as you mentioned, in which you had 5 countries, I think it is, suspend their funding. These were the major funders, U.S. being chief among those, seems to have been, this is the way that we bury the ICJ rulings, that ultimately the power of the ICJ ultimately lies in the political response by these countries, which is also a function of their domestic politics and people hearing these rulings and having a different perspective on what's going on there than they had prior to that. I don't know, the only thing that remains, it seems to me, is the ICJ's sort of enforcement, and they're requiring Israel to do what over the next, my understanding is 25 days or 30 days at this point. And then what happens at that point?
So, I share your opinion. I don't think that the timing was coincidental. I don't think that it was just a coincidence that they revealed this. And I think that the reason that it's not coincidental is because Israel's been trying to bury the ICJ decision. They know that this was a blow to them, that this is a huge loss. And as much as they've been trying to spin it, they know that they can't. They're now in the same category as other genocidal, other states that have been accused of genocide. Myanmar, Rwanda, former Yugoslavia, Cambodia, Germany. And that doesn't sit very well with them. So one of the ways of doing away with that is to pivot and try to change the conversation to be about something else, which is why they focused on UNRWA. And, UNRWA, I don't know how much you know about this, but this has long been the issue that Israel's tried to try to do away with. Because in their minds, if they get rid of UNRWA, UNRWA was established in the aftermath of the Nakba, 1948, and it's supposed to provide for Palestinian refugees until they're able to go home, until a solution is provided. And so in Israel's mind, if they get rid of UNRWA, it gets rid of the Palestinian refugee issue. It doesn't, but that's the way that their logic is working. But to take it forward so it's not at all surprising that they tried to go after it. This is one of the first things that when Trump was in office, that the Israelis pushed for was for Trump to cut funding to UNRWA, and he did. And I think
there's been a long-standing attempt to get rid of UNRWA. The biggest critique of UNRWA that I have seen that sort of pre-existed this latest accusation was that the agency was being accused of maintaining the Palestinian sense that they were refugees. As if it was their, well, yes, but it was as if we are criticizing this agency for not depoliticizing, essentially, and for not decontextualizing the situation that the Palestinian people find themselves in. And it is if you maintain a 30,000 foot perspective on that critique, there's some wiggle room. But when you start to drill down into what the critique actually is, it's rather shocking in some way. I mean, it's almost as if they want UNRWA to be a pacification tool of some sort, and they're mad that it's not.
Exactly. Precisely.
And so they come back to the ICJ supposedly with a report.
Right. So I was going to get to that. Yes. Okay. So you're right. I think it's now 25 days. The Israelis have to report back, stating what measures they've taken to implement the 5 elements that I talked about earlier. And from there, If nothing has been done, it can go to the Security Council. Now, there might be a ceasefire in the interim period. I don't know. One thing that it's important, and I think before I continue, it's important to state, law is never going to replace politics. And the legal system is always going to nudge politicians. It's always going to nudge activists in the right way, but it's never going to replace that. And so I say this because as much as Israel might do, at the end of the day, it's going to most likely end up in the UN Security Council with a question of whether the US is going to use its veto in the Security Council to once again protect Israel. Not a good look. Or whether it will abstain from condemning Israel. Again, not a good look. Or whether it's going to vote in favor. And the reason that I think that this is where we're going to end up is if you just look at what's happened since the ICJ ruling, if you just look at what's been going on in Gaza for the past few days, Israel's still killing Palestinians at the same pace. And aid is not being allowed in. And the military is still behaving the same way that it was behaving before. There isn't an attempt to preserve evidence. In other words, nothing that the ICJ has requested has actually been done. And, and this, if I may, I want to pivot to something to show the interplay between law and politics. Because back in 2004, this isn't the first time that Israel is before the ICJ. It's the first time when there's a case that's a dispute. But back in 2004, I was actually part of the team that worked on the case where it was a legal question about whether Israel's wall is legal. And that came out in 2004.
And this is the wall that runs along the West Bank.
That's right. Runs right inside of it. Okay. It runs inside of it. In some places, it's a concrete 25-foot high wall. In some places, it's barbed wire with roads and takes a large, like maybe about 50 feet of land. But it snakes through the West Bank. It's not like it's just all through the West Bank. And it separates Palestinians from Palestinians. It's a terrible structure, and has just caused so much havoc and so much death and theft of land. And it really just goes around the settlements, keeping the settlements, pushing the settlements onto the Israeli side and putting Palestinians behind a wall. And in 2004, we took Israel to the ICJ. And in that decision, the court came out and said, same numbers, by the way, but it was a different composition, same numbers saying the wall is illegal and that the wall should be removed. Here we are 20 years later, the wall is still standing. Now, in the ruling, the court said, not only did they say the wall is illegal, but they said third states also have a responsibility when it comes to the wall. Again, this isn't genocide, but it's a wall. And what happened is for a year, we waited and waited and waited and thought, okay, now the world is going to do something about it. And as I said, law doesn't ever replace politics. And the world did nothing. But exactly 1 year to the day of the ruling. So the ruling came out July the 9th of 2004. July the 9th of 2005, the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement was launched. And the reason that it was launched is because they said, we've been waiting for the international community to step forward and do something, and we don't see that that's coming. And so we as activists are going to start pushing and pressuring Israel and pushing and pressuring the world to hold Israel accountable. And so even if Israel comes forward in its 1 month time, now 25 days time, and I know what this report is going to look like, it's going to be a nothing report because they have nothing positive to report on. And even if the US vetoes, again, not a good look, or abstains, not a good look, I do think that this is going to lead to a greater push for grassroots activism to hold Israel accountable, whether through pushing for arms embargoes, pushing to hold these criminals accountable, you name it. And that's where I think the hope is going to lie.
You mentioned you're in Haifa, and you both mentioned sort of the ruling from the ICJ validated what you see, and certainly I know that what we see in this country. My understanding is in the context of Israel, there is both a censorship regime and almost a sort of internalized censorship by a lot of the media as to what's going on in Gaza that we in the United States have more access to, both in part because folks I think are a little bit more invested in seeking it out as opposed to avoiding that stuff. But I wonder, what your sense of that is, like how much, because we've seen the polling out of the Israeli population. They may have grave issues with Netanyahu, but it is not over what's happening in Gaza. Quite the opposite, or in spite of they seem to largely support what's happening in Gaza. I wonder, your sense of that, how much of the Israeli population is exposed to what's going on there, either because they don't have access to it or they don't want access to it. And I also wonder the response to the ICJ ruling, if that moved the needle within the context of that society.
It's a great questions, and the answer is it's mixed. So, Israelis have the same access to internet that I do, to watch Al Jazeera. You don't even need to speak Arabic to understand what's happening and see the images. They have the same access to it. They have the same access to the people on Instagram that I do. And so some of them just don't want to see it. Now, I'll talk about the mainstream Israeli media, and then I'll talk about what Israelis are doing. So mainstream Israeli media, it sort of starts the same every day. They start off with reciting the names of Israeli soldiers who have been killed and a little bit of a biography. And then they'll show you images inside Gaza, but you don't see people. You just see shooting. You just see like tanks. You see some level of destruction, but you don't see humans. You don't see Palestinians. And then from there, it pivots to somebody usually making some crazy statement like, we have to hit them harder, faster, more. There should be 100,000 killed by now. This is an actual statement. And then you're in this up and down, up and down, up and down. And then it pivots to like critique of Netanyahu, but then goes back to the same thing of we need to hit them harder and more and that sort of stuff. And that's mainstream media. But as I said, it might be censored on the mainstream media in terms of the images that they see, but I have the same access that they do. And so a lot of it is that they don't want to see what's happening to Palestinians. And this isn't the first time. War is not only big business in Israel, but it's lucrative for the politicians. There is yet to be a war in Israel over the past 2.5 decades where it's changed public opinion. It's the opposite. Unpopular leaders, if they attack Gaza or if they attack the West Bank or if they attack Lebanon, their popularity goes up. And so it's this weird phenomena where it's not weird, but this is what Israel is. It's that as much as they're critical of Netanyahu, they're not at all critical of the war, not at all. And the overall refrain that I hear every day is, and you see it on posters everywhere, finish them, aka Nikki Haley, written in English, by the way, to things like screw them, to flatten Gaza. This is the prevalent feeling here, and very little introspection about what it means to be Palestinian. In terms of the ICJ, again, mixed. The Israelis came out immediately and said, oh, the ICJ ruled in our favor. It didn't. And then there has been some media that said, hey, we're now in the category of these other countries. maybe we should be easing up. But still, what's missing in all of this is a sense of what the devastation and the long-term impact of what they've done on Gaza. And that part, I don't think there's been any real introspection about.